What if one agreement changed the Middle East more than 20 years of conflict? What if the most important victory in modern warfare wasn't measured by territory captured or cities destroyed, but by convincing an adversary that continuing the fight would cost more than ending it? For more than 2 decades, Iran's nuclear program sat at the center of one of the world's most dangerous strategic rivalries. Sanctions came and went. Diplomatic negotiations stalled. Military strikes delayed progress but never appeared to eliminate the underlying challenge. Each new crisis seemed to reset the clock rather than resolve it. Then, almost overnight, headlines around the world suggested something few analysts believed was possible. Reports indicated that Tehran had signaled a willingness to suspend additional uranium enrichment while broader negotiations moved forward. Whether viewed as a diplomatic breakthrough or a temporary pause, the announcement immediately raised a larger question. What changed? Because agreements of this magnitude rarely emerge from diplomacy alone. They usually reflect a shift in calculations that has been building long before leaders ever sit down at the negotiating table. Modern conflicts are increasingly decided long before the final document is signed. Military operations, economic pressure, intelligence gathering, cyber campaigns, financial isolation, and political signaling all combine into a single message. The objective is not simply to destroy an opponent's capabilities. It is to convince that opponent that continuing resistance no longer improves its position. Throughout the past several years, pressure on Iran accumulated across multiple fronts. Economic restrictions limited access to international financial markets. Energy exports became increasingly difficult. Regional tensions repeatedly threatened commercial shipping through one of the world's most important maritime corridors. At the same time, repeated strikes against military infrastructure demonstrated how vulnerable even heavily protected facilities could become under sustained pressure. None of these developments alone necessarily determined the outcome. Together, however, they gradually altered the balance between the costs of confrontation and the potential benefits of negotiation. Military strategists often describe this process as shaping the decision environment. Instead of seeking immediate battlefield victory, they attempt to narrow the choices available to the opposing leadership until one option becomes significantly less costly than all the others. This approach relies less on dramatic offensives than on persistent pressure. Every disrupted supply chain, every damaged logistics hub, every restricted source of revenue, every additional uncertainty inside financial markets. Over time, each becomes another variable influencing political decision-making. Energy played an especially important role. The Middle East remains one of the world's most significant oil-producing regions, and maritime trade through the Persian Gulf continues to affect global energy prices. Whenever shipping faces uncertainty, insurance premiums rise, freight costs increase, commodity markets react almost immediately. Even the possibility of disruption can ripple across supply chains thousands of miles away. That reality transforms regional military competition into a global economic issue. Any government involved must therefore weigh not only military objectives but also the broader economic consequences of prolonged escalation. Diplomacy becomes more attractive when both sides recognize that instability is imposing costs well beyond the battlefield. This is where modern deterrence differs from earlier generations of conflict. Traditional military planning often focused on destroying forces. Today's strategic competition increasingly focuses on influencing decisions. Rather than asking how many targets can be eliminated, planners may instead ask how to reshape an opponent's incentives. Can financial pressure reduce military options? Can logistical disruption complicate future operations? Can uncertainty itself become a strategic tool? These questions increasingly define a 21st century security policy. Open-source defense analysts frequently describe this as integrated pressure. Economic measures reinforce military signaling. Military deployments reinforce diplomatic negotiations. Intelligence collection improves operational planning while simultaneously increasing political leverage. No single action changes the entire picture. The cumulative effect often matters far more than any individual event. By the time negotiations finally begin, much of the real contest has already taken place. That does not necessarily mean trust has been restored, nor does it guarantee a lasting peace. History offers many examples where ceasefires eventually collapsed because underlying disputes remained unresolved. Missile programs, regional influence, proxy relationships, security guarantees, verification mechanisms, all continue to present difficult challenges even after initial agreements are announced. Any future arrangement therefore depends not only on political promises but also on verification, transparency, and continued dialogue between parties that have spent decades viewing one another as strategic rivals. For policymakers, the central question extends far beyond a single agreement. It becomes whether a temporary pause can evolve into a more durable security framework. Can military pressure successfully transition into diplomatic stability? Or does it simply postpone another cycle of confrontation? Those questions remain unanswered. But one reality is increasingly clear. Modern conflicts are no longer decided solely by the largest bombs or the fastest missiles. They are shaped by logistics, economics, intelligence, technology, and political endurance. When those elements begin working together, they can influence decisions that years of direct confrontation fail to produce. And that may be the most significant lesson of all. If diplomacy marked the beginning of a new chapter, implementation would determine whether that chapter actually lasted. History suggests that signing an agreement is often the easiest part. Enforcing one is far more difficult. Any arrangement involving nuclear material requires an extraordinary level of technical verification. Inspectors must confirm not only declared inventories, but also ensure that enrichment activities remain suspended, equipment is accounted for, and monitoring systems continue operating over time. Even under ideal conditions, that process can take months or even years. In heavily damaged facilities, the challenge becomes even greater. Engineers may first need to secure unstable structures before inspectors can safely enter. Environmental monitoring, radiation surveys, material accounting, and chain minus of minus custody procedures all become part of an operation that is as much scientific as it is diplomatic. Verification, not political statements, ultimately determines credibility. Meanwhile, regional security concerns remain far from resolved. Even if nuclear minus-related tensions ease, broader strategic competition continues. Missile development, air defense modernization, cyber capabilities, maritime security, proxy networks. These issues exist alongside the nuclear question rather than disappearing because of it. For neighboring countries, the objective is not simply preventing one specific capability. It is maintaining a balance that discourages future conflict while avoiding another cycle of escalation. That balance has always been fragile. It remains so today. Energy security also continues to shape every strategic decision. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the world's most important maritime choke points. A significant share of global oil exports passes through this narrow waterway every day. When shipping moves normally, global markets often take its stability for granted. When uncertainty appears, however, energy prices respond almost immediately. Insurance costs rise. Shipping schedules change. Governments begin reviewing emergency supply plans. For that reason, maritime stability has become inseparable from international economic stability. Military planners understand this reality. So do financial markets. This explains why naval deployments often serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They deter potential attacks. They reassure commercial shipping. They provide intelligence. And perhaps most importantly, they signal political commitment without necessarily crossing the threshold into open conflict. Sometimes the mere presence of capable forces influences decisions before any weapon is ever used. This is one of the defining characteristics of modern deterrence. Influence increasingly matters as much as firepower. Technology has accelerated this transformation. Satellite surveillance, long-range sensors, unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, and real-time communications allow governments to monitor situations with unprecedented speed. Decision-makers receive information faster than ever before. But faster information does not automatically produce easier decisions. In fact, it often compresses the time available for diplomacy. Leaders may have only hours or even minutes to determine whether an incident represents an accident, a misunderstanding, or deliberate escalation. That makes communication channels just as important as military capability. Miscalculation remains one of the greatest dangers in any crisis. A technical malfunction, a radar misidentification, an unexpected naval encounter. Any of these could trigger responses that neither side originally intended. For this reason, crisis management has become a discipline of its own within modern defense planning. Avoiding war can require as much preparation as fighting one. The political dimension is equally significant. Every government involved must explain agreements to domestic audiences. Supporters emphasize stability. Critics warn about concessions. Military leaders focus on security. Economic officials emphasize recovery. These competing narratives often continue long after negotiations conclude. Public perception therefore becomes another battlefield, one fought through media, diplomacy, and strategic communication rather than missiles. For ordinary people across the region, however, the priorities are often much simpler. Stable energy prices, reliable employment, safe transportation, predictable trade, the absence of air raid sirens, the ability to plan for the future instead of preparing for the next emergency. These are the outcomes that ultimately define whether diplomacy succeeds. Not headlines, not speeches, but daily life. Looking ahead, analysts continue to debate whether the current period represents a genuine turning point, or simply another pause in a decades-long rivalry. Some argue that sustained economic incentives could encourage greater regional stability. Others believe unresolved security concerns will eventually return both sides to confrontation. There is evidence supporting both perspectives. That uncertainty reflects the complexity of modern geopolitics. Very few conflicts end with a single decisive moment. Most evolve through long periods of competition interrupted by temporary agreements, renewed negotiations, and occasional crises. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of this entire story. Military power alone rarely delivers lasting peace. Diplomacy without leverage often struggles to achieve meaningful results. Economic pressure without political dialogue can become unsustainable. And agreements without verification rarely survive changing political circumstances. Lasting stability usually emerges only when all of these elements work together. That process is rarely dramatic. It is gradual, measured, sometimes frustratingly slow. Yet history often remembers those quiet strategic shifts more than the moments of battlefield spectacle. Because while wars may begin with explosions, they often end with calculations. Calculations about cost, about risk, about endurance, and ultimately about the future. Whether this agreement becomes a lasting foundation for regional stability or merely another pause before renewed competition will depend on choices that have yet to be made. The negotiations may have concluded, but the larger strategic story is still unfolding. And the next chapter will likely be written not only by diplomats and military planners, but by the economic realities, technological advances, and political decisions that continue shaping the Middle East long after the headlines fade.